The cold woke the valley before the sun. It was a silence, not a sound, a stillness that meant the great storm, the 3-day blizzard, had finally passed, leaving the world scoured and new. Elias Thorne pushed open the heavy door of his cabin, a low-slung structure of earth and timber built into the south-facing slope. The snow had buried it, insulating him, protecting him. He had been warm. He had been safe. He emerged into a world that was paralyzed, frozen in a blinding white shroud. The sun, when it finally struck the peaks, was a cold fire offering light but no heat. The air was so sharp it hurt to breathe, freezing the moisture in his beard instantly. His cabin, the one they called a dirt hole, the one they called a savage burrow, had held the warmth. He looked down the slope toward the new settlement, the ambitious little town of Providence, a mile distant. There was no smoke. That was the first sign. Usually the morning air was thick with the scent of pine and hickory burning. Now nothing moved. The thin, Eastern-style houses, built tall and proud with their sharp roofs and glass windows, were just dark shapes against the drifts. They looked brittle. They looked dead. Thorne pulled his buffalo robe tighter, his breath a plume of white. He had warned them. He had told Jedediah Slade, the town's founder, that the mountains demanded respect. He told him the wind that came down from the high passes had teeth. Slade had laughed, clapping him on the back, calling him Old Mountain. The settlers had laughed. They were men of progress, men of sawmills and iron stoves. They saw Thorne's low cabin, built with techniques taught to him by the Ute people, as a step backward, a denial of civilization. Now, civilization was silent. He strapped on his snowshoes, the gut lacing creaking in the sub-zero air. The walk was a trial. The snow was deep, powdery on top but with a hard crust beneath that sometimes broke, plunging him down to his waist. He moved slowly, methodically. He was not a man in a hurry. He was a man bearing witness. As he drew closer, the silence became heavier. He saw a mule, frozen solid, still tethered to a post, its head bowed. He saw the new bright blue sign for Slade's Mercantile, torn from its hinges, half buried. He reached the main street. The houses were entombed. Snow was drifted clear up to the eaves. Here and there, a window was shattered, a pale spiderweb of frost. He heard a sound. A low, terrible sound. It was a woman, weeping. He followed the sound to the largest house, the one Slade had built for himself. The door was blocked by a drift, but it was slightly ajar, choked with ice. He pushed. It didn't move. He put his shoulder to it, using his weight, and the ice cracked, the wood groaned. He slipped inside. It was almost as cold inside as it was out. The fire in the great stone fireplace was dead. The ashes were cold. In the center of the room, huddled under blankets, were the survivors. He counted 6. Jedediah Slade was among them, his face gray, his eyes hollow. But the man who stood, the man whose authority had not frozen, was the stranger, the man from the east, Captain Marcus Hale, a territorial official, a surveyor sent by the government. Hale, wrapped in a threadbare traveling coat, held a pistol, though his hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip it. His uniform was stiff with frost. He looked at Thorne, this wild man appearing from the snow, warm, breathing easy, his eyes clear. Hale's gaze dropped to Thorne's heavy furs, his insulated moccasins, and then back to the frozen, desperate room. The captain didn't speak. He just stared, the realization dawning on his face. The mockery was over. The lesson had arrived. The fire is low, and the wind whispers through the pines. It tells stories of the high country, of hard winters and harder choices. If this tale finds you well, leave a word in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from and what the wind sounds like in your part of the world. We have a long night ahead, and the stories are just beginning. It had all begun in the autumn, a season of false promises. The aspens had turned a brilliant, burning gold, and the air was crisp, full of energy. Elias Thorne had finished chinking his cabin, mud and grass plugs pounded tight between the massive logs. He had dug his home into the hillside, using the earth itself as a wall against the wind he knew was coming. The Ute elder, his friend Stone in the Water, had watched him, nodding approval. "The badger," the elder said, "builds his house low. The eagle builds his high, but the badger is warm in the storm." Thorne had nodded. He had spent 10 years in these mountains. He had learned to listen. He had learned that survival was not about fighting the land, but about being accepted by it. He had traded furs for smoked venison and the advice was always the same. Respect the wind, respect the cold, respect the spirits of the place. Then the wagons came. They were loud. They carried the smell of progress, which to Thorne smelled mostly of iron, greed, and misplaced confidence. Jedediah Slade was their leader, a man with a booming voice and a map full of lines that meant nothing. He called the valley Providence, a name that presumed the favor of a god Thorne wasn't sure had ever visited these peaks. Slade was building a town. He had lumber, milled thin and quick, brought in on groaning wagons. He had glass for windows, bright and clear, to let the light in, as he said. He was selling plots of land to families who had come west with dreams of parlor stoves and main streets. They saw the mountains as a backdrop, a painting, not as a living, breathing power that held life and death in its hands. They saw Thorne's cabin, and they laughed. "Why, that's just a hovel," Slade had declared, loud enough for all to hear. "A man doesn't live in the dirt. A man rises above it." The settlers, eager to please their new leader, joined in. They called him Badgerman. Idri. They mocked his fur clothing, his preference for moccasins over hard-heeled boots. Thorne said nothing. He just continued his work. He stacked his firewood 10 cords deep. He traded with the Ute for smoked fish and dried berries. He reinforced his small horse stable, banking it with sod. He was preparing for a war. Not a war with men, but with the sky. In October, the government man arrived, Captain Marcus Hale. He was a different sort, quiet, observant, with eyes that measured everything. He was a man of science, of maps and sextants. He was charting the territory, drawing lines on paper that would one day become counties and states. He stopped at Thorne's cabin, more out of curiosity than respect. He asked questions. "Why this design? The logs are twice the thickness required." Thorne had pointed to the ridges. "The wind," he said. "It doesn't ask permission." Hale had noted it in his journal. Primitive, but efficient use of natural insulators. He visited Slade's new town, admiring the sawmill, the straight lines, the optimism. "This," Slade had told Hale, "is the future. This is how we tame this land." Thorne had met Hale one last time at the edge of the new town. The first snows were already dusting the peaks. "Captain," Thorne said, his voice quiet, "tell them to bank their foundations. Tell them to cut more wood, at least 3 times what they have." Hale had looked at the sky, then at the bustling town. "They seem to be managing, Mr. Thorne. They have iron stoves." Thorne had just shaken his head. "The stove is hungry," he replied, "and that wind will steal the heat right through their glass." Hale had watched him walk away, a man out of time. But as the winter deepened, as the days grew shorter and the grey clouds gathered in the north, Hale couldn't shake the feeling that the man who was out of time was not Thorne, but Slade. The world at stake was not just the town, but the very idea of what it meant to survive. It was a contest between pride and wisdom, and the mountain had already chosen its side. The attack came not with a war cry, but with a whisper. It started as a greying of the sky, a change in the pressure of the air that Thorne felt in his bones. The horses in his small stable grew restless. The wind, which had been his constant companion, fell silent. A terrible, heavy hush fell over the valley. The Ute called it the breath before the white. Then the first flakes began to fall. They were not soft, gentle flakes, but hard, stinging pellets, driven by a wind that seemed to come from all directions at once. Thorne barred his door. He checked his chimney drawer. he settled in. For 3 days, the world vanished. The sound was a living thing. It was a high-pitched scream that never stopped, the sound of a giant hand scraping the mountains clean. It was a roar, a physical weight that pressed against his small cabin. But his cabin held. The snow, his enemy, became his friend. It piled deep on the sod roof, deep against the north-facing wall, until he was living in a bubble of quiet, insulated from the rage outside. His small fire burned steadily, the heat reflected off the thick logs, held fast by the packed earth floor. He had water from a small snow-melt trickle he diverted from a spring, which ran in a small trough inside the wall. He had food. He was warm. He listened to the storm and he felt a deep, profound respect. He did not feel fear. He felt small, but he felt safe, because he had obeyed the laws of the mountain. He thought of the town. He thought of their glass windows. He knew, with a terrible certainty, what the wind was doing to that glass. He knew what the cold was doing to their thin-milled walls. They had built for appearance. They had built for pride. They had not built for the white. The wind would find every crack, every gap where the wood had shrunk. It would pour into their homes like an invading army. Their iron stoves, the ones they were so proud of, would demand wood, more and more wood, until the houses were colder than the barns. They would burn their furniture. They would burn their dreams. He closed his eyes, imagining the sound of glass shattering, the cries of the children, the panic as the cold, the real cold, the killing cold, found them. On the 4th morning he awoke to silence. The wind had stopped. The sudden absence of the roar was deafening. He knew this was the end of the storm, but the beginning of the reckoning. The temperature would have plummeted in the clear, still air after the storm's passage. This was the coldest moment. This was when the frostbite took its due. He knew he had to go. It was not a question. It was an oath, unspoken, made to the valley itself. You do not let a neighbor freeze, even a neighbor who mocked you. You do not let a child pay the price for a father's pride. He prepared. He ate dried meat, a handful of berries. He filled a skin with water, knowing it would freeze in an hour. But he took it anyway. He checked his knife. He pulled on his heaviest robe, the one of buffalo hide, and tied his moccasins tight. His oath was simple. He would go. He would see. He would help, if help was still possible. He opened his door to the new world, a world of blinding white and devastating beauty. He stepped out, leaving the warmth behind, and set his face toward the frozen silence of Providence. The journey to the town was a battle. The world had been remade. Drifts that were taller than a man blocked the path, forcing him to climb, to crawl, to find a new way. The air was thin and sharp as a shard of ice. He breathed through his fur collar, warming the air before it entered his lungs. The sun on the snow was blinding, a cruel, beautiful glare. He kept his eyes on the smoke, or rather the lack of it. That silence was the loudest sound in the valley. He finally crested the last drift, looking down on what remained of Main Street. It was a graveyard of ambition. The tall, false fronts of the buildings were plastered in snow like monuments. He saw movement, faint, near Slade's Mercantile. It was Captain Hale, the official, trying to clear a path with a broken shovel, his movements slow, exhausted. Thorne walked into the center of the street, his snowshoes making a soft, rhythmic hush. Hale looked up. His face was a mask of frost, his lips cracked and blue. He was a man of charts and figures, a man who believed in the straight line, the measured angle. All his measurements had failed. "Thorne," he whispered, his voice rough. "They're inside. Some of them." Thorne nodded. He didn't need to ask. He went to the Mercantile, the place that had been the center of their pride. The door was gone, shattered. Inside, the gloom was heavy. The survivors were huddled together, maybe a dozen people, wrapped in every blanket, every bolt of cloth Slade had in stock. Jedediah Slade himself was there, slumped against a barrel, his hands buried in his coat, his eyes vacant. A small child was crying, a thin, weak sound. Thorn didn't speak. He walked to the center of the room. He looked at the dead stove, the empty wood box. He looked at the faces, pale and drawn, tinged with blue. This was the consequence. This was the price of ignoring the wind. He turned to Hale. "The ones who can walk," Thorn said, his voice filling the cold room. "Get them ready." Slade looked up, his eyes focusing for the first time. "Ready? Ready for what, Thorn? To die in the snow?" Thorn looked at the man who had mocked him. "No, Slade, to live. We're going to my cabin." A woman laughed, a high, broken sound. Your dirt hole, it's buried. We'll freeze before we get there." Thorn's gaze was steady. "You are freezing here," he said. "My home is warm. It is alive. This is a tomb." Hale, the man of logic, made the decision. He rose to his feet, pulling himself straight with military stiffness, though he was shaking. "He's right," Hale said. "This town, this was a mistake. Our only chance is with him." He pointed at Thorn. "Do as he says. We walk or we die." That was the alliance. It was not a joining of friends. It was not a pact of respect. It was the desperate, grasping alliance of the dying clutching at the living. It was the humbled and the broken following the one man they had despised because he was the only one who had been right. Thorn nodded once. He took the smallest child from her mother's arms, wrapping the girl in his own robe against his chest. "Follow my tracks," he said. "Do not stop. Do not sit down. We go now." He turned and walked out of the store, back into the blinding white, the small procession of shivering ghosts stumbling behind him. The journey back was a different kind of trial. It was not a journey of one man, but a chain of weary, broken people bound together by the single hope of warmth. Thorn broke the trail, his powerful, steady strides packing the snow. Behind him, Captain Hale carried one of a new settler's smaller children, his face a mask of grim determination. Jedediah Slade, the town builder, the man of progress, stumbled, falling to his knees. His pride was gone, frozen, left back in the ruined mercantile. Another settler, a blacksmith Thorn had seen but never spoken to, hauled Slade to his feet. "Not here, Jed," the man muttered. "Not like this." They were a ragged line of failures, their fine eastern clothes useless against the high country cold. They saw, perhaps for the first time, the world as Thorn saw it. They saw it as a power, indifferent to their plans, their maps, their ambitions. They finally reached the hillside. All the settlers saw was a mound of snow, adrift against the slope. "Where is it?" the woman asked, her voice thin. "We are here," Thorn said. He moved to a spot, dug with his hands, and pulled open the heavy, fur-draped door. A small puff of warm, earthy-smelling air escaped. A promise. "Inside," he commanded. They hesitated. To go from the bright, terrible white into that dark hole, it was the final surrender. It was admitting their glass windows and tall roofs were a lie. Hale went first, ducking his head. "Get in," he ordered. One by one they filed in. The last was Slade, who paused at the door, looking back at his frozen town, a dark shape in the valley below. Then he bowed his head and entered the badger's den. The reckoning was not loud, it was silent. It was the feeling of warmth. It was not the biting, dry heat of an iron stove, but a deep, penetrating warmth that came from the earth, from the thick walls, from the steady, efficient fire Thorn had banked. The cabin was small, but it was alive. The air was still. The wind that had terrified them was just a muffled whisper, a story being told somewhere far away. The settlers, the neighbors, stood in the middle of the room, blinking, steam rising from their frozen clothes. They looked at the construction. The massive logs, the way the roof was braced, the smart, small flue that drew the smoke perfectly. They saw the stores of food, the dried herbs hanging, the skins piled for sleeping. This was not a hovel. This was a fortress. Thorn handed the small child back to her mother. He pointed to the water skin, which he had hung near the fire. "Drink when it's thawed, slowly." He tended his fire, adding a single, seasoned log. The settlers huddled, unsure what to do. They had been the mockers. He was the savior. The power had shifted. Captain Hale, the official, stood by the fire, warming his blue hands. He looked around the small space, his surveyor's eye assessing, measuring. He was a man of facts, and the facts were undeniable. He turned to Thorne, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice formal, we built for arrogance. We built what we wanted the land to be." He gestured to the thick walls, the earthen floor. "You built for what the land is." He looked at Slade, then at the others. "We may have grander houses in Providence, but I am an official of the territory, and I will put it in my report. Elias Thorne has the warmest home in this valley." The reckoning was complete. Pride had frozen to death, and humility had found a place by the fire. They stayed in the cabin for 2 days, huddled together, listening as the wind returned for one last angry howl before finally surrendering to the clear, cold blue. Thorne shared his food without a word. He gave them smoked fish and dried meat. He melted snow for water. He sat by his fire, sharpening his knife, tending his gear, as if he were alone. But he was not. The settlers watched him. They studied his movements. They saw a man who wasted nothing, no motion, no word, no resource. He was a part of the mountain, and his cabin was a part of him. Jedediah Slade, the boomer, was the most changed. He sat in the corner, rocking slightly, his eyes never leaving Thorne. He had lost his store, his goods, his dream. But in that small, warm space, he was finding something else, a terrible, necessary humility. On the second night, with the others sleeping, Slade moved closer to the fire. "Thorne," he whispered, his voice cracked. I laughed at you." Thorne didn't look up. He continued to work grease into a leather strap. "The mountain doesn't care about laughter," Thorne replied. "It only cares about truth." Slade nodded, a single sharp jerk of his head. "Why?" Slade asked. "Why save us? You could have stayed here, warm. You owed us nothing. We gave you nothing but scorn." Thorne finally stopped his work. He looked at Slade, his eyes reflecting the low fire. "I didn't save you, Jedediah. I saved the child you were letting freeze. I saved the mother. I saved the man in you that was dying of pride." He turned back to his work. "Your debt is not to me, it's to the land. You came here and you didn't listen. Now you have." Captain Hale had been awake, listening. He sat up from his pile of furs. "He's right, Slade." Hale looked at Thorne. "We came with maps, with deeds, with ideas of control. We measured the rivers, but we never asked them where they wanted to flow. We measured the trees, but we never asked them about the wind." Hale, the man of science, the government official, looked humbled. "My report will be different now," he said. "It won't just be about resources. It will be about respect, about a different kind of wisdom." He recognized that the lines he drew on his maps were illusions. The only true lines were the ones the mountain drew, the lines of survival, of cold, of wind, and of shelter. The neighbors had mocked the cabin because they feared it. They feared it represented a savage life, a life where their civilized rules didn't apply. They had just learned in the most brutal way that they were right. The mountain's rules were the only ones that mattered. The thaw came, slow and painful. The survivors returned to their frozen town, not as conquerors, but as refugees. They found more loss. Some who had tried to weather the storm in their own homes had not survived. The town of Providence was a place of mourning, but it was also a place of change. They began to rebuild, but they did not rebuild the same. The hammers and saws were busy again, but the new sounds were different. They were building lower, thicker. They were banking their foundations with sod, just as Thorne had. They were splitting twice the wood. Jedediah Slade led the work, his booming voice gone, replaced by a quiet, grim determination. He was no longer building a monument to himself. He was building a shelter. Spring finally came, painting the valley in green. Captain Hale prepared to leave. He came to Thorne's cabin one last time. He didn't offer money. He knew Thorne would refuse. Instead, he brought a gift A new, sharp axe head from the east, the finest steel. My official report, Hale said, lists this valley as inhospitable for settlement without adaptation to local conditions. I specifically mentioned your cabin, Mr. Thorne. I called it the standard for survival. I don't think they'll be bothering you. Thorne accepted the axe head, weighing it in his hand. He nodded. It was a good gift. An understanding had passed between them. Hale rode out, his maps redrawn in his mind, if not on paper. Elias Thorne remained. He watched the town of Providence slowly heal. The people no longer mocked him. They no longer called him Badger Man. When they passed him on the trail, they nodded. It was a nod of respect, of debt. They sometimes left offerings at the edge of his clearing, a sack of flour, a tin of coffee. He accepted them, and sometimes he left a haunch of venison or a string of fish in return. A quiet, unspoken peace had been made. The cabin on the hill was no longer a sign of savagery. It was a reminder. It was a lesson, built of earth and timber, written by the wind. The narrator's voice settles, the firelight playing on his face. The mountains teach a hard lesson, but they teach it only once. They teach that pride is a thin coat against a winter wind. They teach that the tallest roof is the first to be taken by the storm. The warmest home is not the one filled with the most things, but the one built with the most understanding. True courage is not in defying the wilderness, but in having the wisdom to listen to it. And true honor is not in being right, but in doing right, even for those who have wronged you. If you enjoyed this story, stay a while longer by the fire. There are more tales from the high country, where honor rides the wind.